What if Bucks Fizz were a two-tone ska band? This week we'll be taking a look at the long and convoluted career of Bucks Fizz, one of the UK's most celebrated Eurovision winners, and also pausing a moment to appreciate two-tone, the punky ska movement that sought to unite the nation's youth during some particularly troubled times. All that and more on this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hi, my name's Morgan Brown, and every Monday I upload a new What If video to my YouTube channel, and then on Wednesdays, one of these companion videos where I discuss the artists and genres involved in the What If video, and also share a little bit of my creative process. The idea of the What If videos is that every week I pick a popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which some change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I happen to have to hand in order to bring that alternative version of the song to life. So the song I picked this week was Making Your Mind Up by Bucks Fizz, and I tried to convert that into a two-tone ska song, so if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster.
Making your mind up. Don't let your indecision take you from behind. Trust your inner vision. Don't let others change your mind. I know you're ready to speak.
So Bucks Fizz were formed, I believe, specifically for the 1981 Eurovision Song Contest. They'd all been singers working in other projects, some of which were also Eurovision entries, but I think they were scouted specifically to come together to form a group to perform the song Making Your Mind Up for the 1981 contest in Dublin. And you can absolutely see the logic behind the group's formation. They're totally going for the ABBA formula. Everyone's very photogenic. We've got the two guys, we've got the two girls, with those ABBA-style close harmonies as well. And if the song was extremely fluffy and lightweight, it's also extremely catchy. Perfect Eurovision fodder, really. Upbeat, instantly memorable, loads of hooks. I think the thing that most people will always remember about that song, or particularly the performance of the song, and the one thing that would have cemented Bucks Fizz's legacy, even if they'd never done anything else, was still the infamous skirt rip, where as they sing the line, if you want to see some more, the two guys, Mike Nolan and Bobby G, turn around to the girls and rip away their skirts to reveal a smaller skirt underneath, causing mild titillation and possibly a small level of scandal amongst more prudish viewers, but it was obviously a hit with the judges, and it's clearly such a hit with Eurovision audiences in general that it's become one of the most imitated bits of stagecraft in the contest's history. Like every year since then, there's at least one act, often several, that incorporates some kind of piece of tearaway clothing in their act. If nothing else, that's definitely an important bit of the Bucks Fizz legacy. But whilst a lot of acts do come together for Eurovision and then rapidly fade away, Bucks Fizz actually managed to sustain a really solid charting pop career straight out of that. Had a really good run of hits, and some of them actually still stand up pretty well. I've always been a big fan of The Land of Make Believe, which has the curious distinction of being the song that unites Bucks Fizz and King Crimson in the kind of rock and pop family tree, having as it does lyrics by Pete Sinfield, who also wrote for King Crimson back in the early days. Bucks Fizz singing lyrics written by the same guy who wrote 21st Century Schizoid Man, which I always think is a wonderful fact. And yeah, just a bunch of great catchy pop songs, again, always with those big shiny ABBA-esque harmonies, My Camera Never Lies, all that stuff. Yeah, and they were really on a pretty impressive run until, sadly, I think towards the end of 1984, they were on their way somewhere and had a coach crash. A really, really bad coach crash. I think they all suffered injuries, but Mike Nolan particularly was in a really, really bad way. Quite severe head injuries, he was in a coma for some time. That really knocked them for six. Although he did recuperate and the band did come back, they never really quite recovered from that sort of loss of momentum and from the trauma of that incident. Jay Aston left the band quite soon afterwards and she was replaced, but although they did manage a bunch more hits after that, they were never quite hitting the level that they had been previously. And you'd think that might be the end of the story, but actually in Bucks Fizz's case, the story of what happened to them after their charting days were over is almost as interesting, really, just because of all the convoluted lineup shenanigans that went on. I think they had their last hit in around 1987ish or something, but carried on through into the 90s. Could still pack him in on tour. The really interesting stuff started, I think sometime in the 90s when Mike Nolan left the group, and as a replacement, Bobby G gets in David Van Day, formerly of Dollar. But it turns out none of the group actually particularly got on very well with Van Day once they'd actually started working with him. And through various convoluted shenanigans, you end up with a situation where David Van Day's the last person left holding the bag. So he ends up with the Bucks Fizz name despite not having been remotely an original member or having appeared on any of their hit records. So there's a point where David Van Day's lineup of Bucks Fizz is then re-recording a bunch of classic Bucks Fizz hits and presenting themselves as the true and authentic Bucks Fizz, while at the same time Bobby G is attempting to establish his own version as the actual Bucks Fizz. So you get this protracted legal battle. So eventually Bobby G finally wins the rights to the name back from David Van Day and continues with his own version of Bucks Fizz, who carry on into the 21st century. But then just to complicate matters even further, the other three original members, Cheryl Baker, Jay Aston and Mike Nolan, decide that they want to reform without Bobby G, but he owns the rights to the name, so the dispute continues, and I think they've ended up performing under a bunch of different names, most recently as The Fizz. Even now there are still these two versions going, the official Bucks Fizz with Bobby G and The Fizz. I think Mike Nolan may have retired, but Jay Aston and Cheryl Baker are still in there, and I think The Fizz have been a bit more active in terms of actually recording, releasing new music. Also, in a rather more depressing turn of events, have occasionally been known to pop up at various events organised or sponsored by the Brexit Party, for which Jay Aston was a candidate in the run-up to Brexit. The Brexit Party, of course, being the party that then went on to become Reform, which, you know, everyone's entitled to their own opinion on these things, but for me, it's kind of soured my impression of the group, which is sad because I've always quite enjoyed a few of those early hits. People in my age particularly grew up watching Cheryl Baker in her other role as a kids' TV presenter, you know, co-presenting Record Breakers with Roy Castle. So she was this friendly, beloved kids entertainer, so to see her aligning herself with this somewhat hateful right-wing group is a bit sad. I don't really know what the other members' political stance is, whether they're mates with Jay Aston, so they're going along with it or not, but it does sour it a little bit for me, unfortunately, to see this group who were originally formed specifically for a contest that was created to promote European unity to be getting behind a cause that's based on splitting the UK from Europe and spreading xenophobia and racism. Around the time that Bucks Fizz were being formed with the goal of promoting European unity, there was another youth movement going on that was, in its own way, propagating ideas of unity as well. And that, of course, is the two-tone ska scene. And two-tone, of course, actually is just the name of the record label run by Jerry Dammers from the Specials, but it's generally accepted more broadly to refer to that whole wave of post-punk ska bands that sprang up around the end of the 70s and the start of the 1980s. And it was a great scene, much needed in the UK at that time. When you look at how things were, Thatcher government's just arrived, unemployment soaring, racial tension reaching pretty much an all-time peak, with the National Front on the rise, recruiting a lot of young people. The UK's youth had pretty much divided into a bunch of different factions, and it was kind of a powder keg waiting to go off. So to have a movement that harnessed elements of both Jamaican popular culture and punk rock and combined them together, performed by multiracial acts, was a really bold and important statement at the time. It's high energy, fun dance music that cuts through the dour hopelessness of the country at that time, but it's also really quite sharp and politically astute. It's got that idealistic edge of something like The Clash, particularly in the hands of its best exponents, the likes of the Specials, as I say, The Beat, who are a fantastic band, The Selector, and even the bands who weren't as explicitly political. Thinking of like Madness, obviously, is the most successful example, Bad Manners. Just being associated with that scene and playing that music in itself was kind of a political act at that time. I tend to think of Madness as a slightly separate thing because they did develop into a very quirky and individual classic British pop act, but they certainly did begin very much as part of that whole two-tone scene, so they're important to include in that discussion. And Bad Manners, although they're generally mainly remembered for a little string of kind of novelty songs, actually did some pretty kind of hard-hitting, decent ska music in their early days as well. I think, as with any openly idealistic movement, it was always sort of doomed to run into a bit of a brick wall, because when faced with the challenges that people were facing in the early 80s, there's only so much that pop music can do to counter that. They undoubtedly did engage a bunch of young people in wanting to participate in positive action. They undoubtedly did some great work in challenging racism, but when all is said and done, there was still insurmountable challenges. There was still massive youth unemployment. There was still a rising tide of racism that no amount of great pop could stop. So you generally find that those bands either adapt, move away from that specific style and become more general pop acts like The Beat and like Madness did, or they kind of fell apart like the Specials and like the Selector. But I think you can certainly argue that the energy and the excitement that that movement created at that turn of the decade absolutely carried over into a bunch of 80s activism. And although the initial lineup of the Specials fell apart in 1981, just after the amazing Ghost Town single, Jerry Dammers carried on. He forms the Special AKA, and it's a testament to the power of that music that their single Nelson Mandela became a massive anthem of the 80s civil rights movement. So yeah, I mean, like all revolutionary pop music, Two-Tone maybe never actually brought about a revolution, but it did all that you could ever have asked for it, which was energize an entire generation of young people. Angry, activist, revolutionary music can also be fun and danceable, which is an important lesson to learn. But anyway, that takes me up to this week's alternative universe scenario. So in my alternate timeline this week, it's 1981. Bobby G, Mike Nolan, Jay Aston and Cheryl Baker have just been brought together to form Bucks Fizz with the specific goal of performing Making Your Mind Up at the 1981 Eurovision Song Contest. It's dark times in the UK, as we know, so I guess the UK team have thought, well, we've got this upbeat, escapist, lightweight, sugary pop song that's going to help lift the nation's spirits and take people's minds off what's going on in the country. So bring in these 4 peppy youngsters to come and sing this song, and it's going well. They're rehearsing the song. One day after rehearsals, they meet up with a friend who says, to wind down after rehearsals, why don't I take you all to the cinema? And they think, yeah, fair enough, we'll go and do that. That sounds like a nice idea. So it takes them along to the pictures. The film they see is Dance Craze, which, as it turns out, is a film entirely about the two-tone scene, featuring great live performances from the Specials and the Selector and Madness and The Beat and the Body Snatchers. Fantastic film. If you haven't seen it, just as a sidebar, I think the entire thing's on YouTube now, so just look it up. It's well worth a watch. They watch this, they've been vaguely aware of this music existing, but they've never really engaged with it before, and they're completely taken with the way that these bands are playing these songs with important, quite bold messages, but delivered in a way that's really fun and exciting, and that's uniting these black and white kids together in a common cause. And Jay Aston, young, idealistic and impressionable as she is at the time, is very inspired by this, and she particularly decides that this is the kind of message that Bucks Fizz need to be taken to Eurovision. So she persuades the others to agree with her, and they go back to the producers and say that they've decided that this is the way forward. They need to rearrange the song. So they rework it from this retro bubblegum pop song into a slightly punk-tinged ska number. So come whatever it is, April the 4th, I think, in Dublin, Bucks Fizz take the stage, representing the two-tone scene to all of Europe. So, in attempting to convert Making Your Mind Up into a two-tone song, my first step as ever is just getting the vocal track, dropping it into GarageBand, syncing it up to the grid. Once that was done, made a couple of tweaks to the tempo. I wanted it to have a nice kind of fairly frantic up-tempo drive, so just slightly tweaked up the BPM a bit there. Next thing was programming on some drums. I went for the retro Motown-y 60s kit, which has a fun retro feel and a really good high snare sound, which is something that I particularly wanted for this. Drum part's fairly simple, but I did try and get in a few fairly signature ska style fills, and then there's a little breakdown section. I think the second time the bridge comes round, I decided to drop it into more of a reggae groove, so do that with just some cross sticking and stuff as well, just to change things up a little bit. Pop some bass on next, going for quite a full, slightly reggae-ish tone, not too much treble, and most of the way through the bass is just sort of walking around, so not staying in one place too much. There's pretty constant movement, and then, as I say, when we get to that reggae breakdown bridge, we drop into a much more of a standard reggae pattern just for that little section. Threw some guitars on next. There's rhythm guitar, which I used my homemade Telecaster for. It's got that nice thin chunky sound, so pretty strictly just offbeat upstrokes, keeping that rhythm going, kind of emphasizing those offbeats to give it that sort of proper ska feel. And then I added some lead guitar, a slightly fuller sound, a little bit more gain, quite a lot of reverb. I was trying to think a little bit of the kind of things that Roddy Radiation used to play in the specials, because although they were strictly a ska band, they always had a little bit of a slightly punky, slightly rockabilly feel to his playing, and so these kind of twangy, string bendy leads that would come in, tried to throw a few of those in, and then when we get to the bridge, dropping into that more reggae-ish, palm muted, little kind of melodic patterns. Then I wanted some organ, picked a good sort of Hammond B3 type sound, and there's nothing terribly fancy going on there. It's mainly just sort of rhythmic chordal stuff. Again, just filling out the sound and emphasising that rhythm as well. And I could have just left it there because quite a few of the two-tone bands had relatively small lineups. It sounded okay like that, but I thought just to make the arrangement a bit bigger, add a bit more variation, I'd throw a few horns on as well. So yeah, just trombones and trumpets, garage band standard sounds, which, as I've often said, don't sound great in isolation, but if you blend them into a mix, they can add something. Pretty simple little lines, mostly in unison. I think a couple of little chordy bits as well, but they just add a bit more flair to things and give it a bit more of an authentic ska feel, I think, as well. Then for the video, as ever, started by just finding some good old performance footage of Bucks Fizz doing the song back in the day. I think it's from maybe some German TV show, I'm not sure, but a good performance clip anyway. So they're there in all their 80s finery singing the song. I wanted a backing band to make it feel more like an actual two-tone group, so found some cool footage of the Selector from the old Grey Whistle test back in about 1980 or thereabouts, might be 79. So edited them in so it looks like they're the band that's backing up the Fizz. Got some bits of footage from the, as I say, the Dance Craze movie in there as well, just to have a bit of an authentic looking two-tone crowd there too. And then as a final touch, just to place them a bit more in the context of that scene, I mocked up a few posters, sneaking the Bucks Fizz logo into various lineups of other notable two-tone groups at the time. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this one. I've been looking for something to do in a two-tone style for a while, and the idea of making your mind up in that style appealed to me for a couple of reasons. Partly just because I've always thought it was a really fun, daft little song, and I figured it would work well in that style, and also because it gave me the opportunity to completely retcon Jay Aston and put her into a scene that absolutely does not align with the values that she currently holds, which I enjoy doing. Let me know what you think of it down in the comments if you'd like, and if you did enjoy it, please do like, share, subscribe, all that stuff really helps the channel. If there's anything else you'd like me to do in coming weeks and months, any artists or songs or genres you'd like me to investigate, do let me know. I always appreciate your suggestions. Otherwise though, that's all from me for this week, so thanks very much indeed for watching, and I'll hope to see you next time.